Hi, I'm Renee Rubacaba, and I read pages 201 to 207. And the first section was language differences between the researcher and the respondent. This section talks about the different types of questions one may ask when conducting a survey and the importance of how the questions must be worded. On page 201, McKay suggests a strategy called decentering, which entails modifications to the source document wording to accommodate concepts that are not directly translatable. It is best to have a native speaker translate, but avoid literal translations because although it may be grammatically correct, the meaning can be lost. In my profession as an ESL teacher coordinator, I also at times need to interpret or translate documents for teachers and parents. I often tell the teachers that it is not good to just copy and paste a note or a letter that they want to send home into a translating website because oftentimes the meaning is lost and the parents end up being confused and they are sometimes left with more questions than they do have answers. So DeLu notes that literal translation is not the goal, but the translation of concepts is the key. Researchers should be aware of the contrast in questions that represent a blame the victim theory versus a transformative theory. An example of a blame the victim question is: are your difficulties in understanding people mainly due to a hearing problem? To be more sensitive, the question could have been worded: are your difficulties in understanding people mainly due to their inabilities to communicate with you? This question is more sensitive because it takes the issue off of them and instead puts the issue on others. On page 202, Mertens mentions the special types of questions, which are demographic, basically background information, and most questions are simple. However, some are harder to answer and are called complex identifications. These questions ask about race, sexual identity, and or orientation and disability. Non-threatening behavioral questions, which are questions that ask about behaviors that are typically performed and easily talked about. This reminds me of the questions parents must answer on the home language usage survey when registering their children for school. The questions are: does the student use a language other than English with family or friends? Do you use a language other than English with the student? Does the student understand when someone communicates with him or her in another language? Does the student read in another language other than English? Does the student write in a language other than English? Does the student interpret for you or for anyone in the home in a language other than English? And the last question is: what language does this student use most frequently at home? And they are given a list of languages that they can choose from, and they are allowed to choose up to 3 languages. If they have marked yes on one of those questions, on one of those 7 questions, then I must pull that student and give them a test, a placement test to see their English language proficiency. And based off of that test, based on how well they did, then it lets me know whether they require English language development services. And back to the other questions, there are sensitive behavioral questions, which typically use words that are familiar to respondents and allows them to place their answers in a sealed envelope or directly in a computer, which increases their chances of being honest. And there are also knowledge questions, which are particularly found on tests in school, and attitude questions. which are questions that typically ask people's opinions. So, as I continue to work on my literature review, it is useful to know the different types of questions and wording to use when interviewing a certain subject or someone in my particular field. Anyway, that's about all I have to say. Bye.